I had grown used to silence. Not the empty kind that echoes in a room after everyone has left, but the deliberate kind I chose for myself. 3 years had passed since the engagement ended, and I had learned to keep my life small, orderly, and mine alone. The library and its archives gave me that. Old parchment, careful ink, the weight of knowledge that asked nothing in return. People came and went through the grand doors of Ravenholt's Central Archive, but I stayed in the back rooms, cataloging, repairing, protecting what time tried to erase. It suited me, or at least I had convinced myself it did. Marek had been pestering me for weeks. "Just dinner," he said, a few familiar faces. You cannot bury yourself among scrolls forever." I agreed only because refusing had become more exhausting than going. The tavern he chose, the Brass Lantern, sat on the edge of the merchant district where the cobblestones were still clean and the lanterns burned with real oil instead of cheap tallow. When I pushed open the heavy door, warm air and the smell of roasted meat and spiced wine washed over me. Laughter and low conversation filled the long room. Then the laughter thinned. They were already seated at the far end, a long table set for 8. Marek waved me over with too much enthusiasm. The others turned as one. I felt their eyes before I reached them, not the casual glance of friends spotting a late arrival. Something sharper. Expectant. I slowed my steps. The empty chair was obvious. It sat between Marek and a woman I did not know. She was tall even while seated, shoulders broad beneath a deep green dress that looked simple but well made. Her skin held the rich, forest deep green of the northern orc clans. Black hair was pulled back into a single braid that fell over one shoulder. She kept her hands folded on the table, fingers laced tight enough that the knuckles showed pale. Her expression was calm, but her eyes moved carefully, reading the room the way someone reads a street before crossing it. Marek stood halfway, grinning in that way he did when he was nervous but pretending he was not. "You made it. Good. Sit, sit." He gestured to the empty chair. "This is Serafina. Serafina, this is—" He hesitated as if suddenly unsure how to finish the introduction. I pulled the chair out and lowered myself into it. The wood creaked. I kept my voice even. "At least tonight I will hear something newer than Marek's 3 favorite stories about the time he almost joined the city guard." A small sound escaped her, not quite a laugh, but close. The corner of her mouth lifted for half a second before she smoothed it away. Around the table, shoulders tightened. Someone coughed into their cup. I understood then. This was not dinner among friends. This was theater, and I had been cast without being asked. The man across from me, Bran, leaned forward on his elbows. He was the loudest of Marek's circle, the one who always needed the last word. His eyes flicked from me to the woman beside me and back again. "So," he said, drawing the word out, "tell us honestly, is she the sort you usually go for?" The table went still. Even the serving girl passing behind us slowed, tray balanced, listening. Serafina lowered her gaze to the folded cloth in front of her. Her fingers tightened further. I set my cup down with deliberate care. The sound of wood meeting wood was soft but final. I met Bran's stare and held it. "No." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples moved outward. Someone's fork clinked against a plate. Marek's smile faltered completely. I continued, voice steady. "She is sharper than most of the company I have kept lately. Warmer, too, and far more interesting than anyone who would ask that question in the first place. If you are wondering whether I am often arranged to sit beside someone this remarkable, the answer is also no." For a moment, no one spoke. The fire in the hearth popped once, loud in the sudden quiet. Serafina lifted her head. Her eyes met mine directly for the first time. There was no gratitude in them, only a quiet recalibration, as if she were adjusting a picture that had been hanging crooked. The defensive set of her shoulders eased by the smallest degree. Bran opened his mouth, then closed it. Color rose along his neck. He reached for his cup and drank too quickly. Marek cleared his throat and tried to steer the conversation towards safer ground, something about a new shipment of wine from the southern passes. The others followed his lead, voices overlapping a little too eagerly. But the air at the table had changed. The performance they had expected had slipped from their hands. I could feel it in the way they glanced at one another, uncertain now who was watching whom. Beside me, Serafina's hands relaxed on the table. She picked up her own cup, turned it once between her fingers, and took a slow sip. When she set it down, she did not look at the others. She looked at me. And for the first time since I had walked through the door, I stopped counting the minutes until I could leave. The conversation around the table tried to recover its rhythm, but it kept stumbling. Marek launched into a story about a merchant caravan that had been delayed by early snow in the passes. Bran laughed too loudly at the punchline. The others joined in a beat late, as if they had forgotten the script. I did not try to help them. I turned slightly toward the woman beside me instead. She had not spoken since my answer to Bran. Her posture remained straight, but the tight line of her shoulders had eased. The green of her dress caught the lamplight in deep folds, almost the color of pine needles in shadow. Up close I could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the kind that came from smiling often, rather than from age. She looked perhaps 30, though I had long since stopped trying to guess the years of orcs by human standards. Their lives moved differently. "You teach," I said quietly, not quite a question. Her gaze flicked to me, surprise, then something warmer. "I do. In the Eastern Quarter, children whose parents cannot pay for tutors. We work with whatever we have, charcoal on slate, sticks in the dirt when the slates run out. What do they draw when they are given real paper?" A small smile touched her mouth. "One boy draws nothing but dragons, enormous ones with wings that stretch across 3 sheets. He says they keep the night from swallowing the streets. Another girl hides a tiny frog in every picture she makes. You have to look carefully or you miss it. And there is a child who draws her mother from memory. She never met her. The lines are careful, almost reverent. She spoke without pity, without performance, just facts shaped by someone who had watched small hands struggle and succeed. I found myself leaning in despite the noise of the tavern. "Do they know you are orc?" I asked. "They know. Some of the parents were uneasy at first. One father came to the door with a walking stick he did not need. He left without using it. The children do not care about old wars. They care whether someone will sit with them until the letters stop swimming on the page." I thought of the archive's back rooms, the quiet order of shelves and the smell of beeswax and old leather. "I keep records," I said, "repair manuscripts that are falling apart. Sometimes I copy passages that would otherwise be lost when the ink finally gives way. It is slow work. Most people never see it." She tilted her head. "Do they come to the library because they already know who they are, or because they hope to become someone else?" The question caught me off guard. I turned it over before answering. "Both, I think. A good book knows what the reader is missing before the reader does." Her smile deepened. It reached her eyes this time. "That is a dangerous thing to admit. It means you have been paying attention." Around us, the table had grown quieter again. Marek kept glancing our way, his mouth half open as if searching for a way back into the conversation. Bran had given up pretending and was staring openly. I ignored them. So did she. When the serving girl brought a platter of warm honey cakes, the scent of toasted oats and sweet resin cut through the heavier smells of meat and wine, Serafina reached for 2 small plates without asking. She set one in front of me and took the other for herself. The gesture was so natural that for a moment I forgot we were being watched. "You are sharing with me," I said. "You defended me," she answered. "That earns you half a cake." I broke off a piece. The honey was dark and fragrant, the kind that came from the high meadows rather than the city hives. It stuck to my fingers. She watched me eat with quiet satisfaction, as if the simple act of someone accepting food from her hand mattered more than the words that had come before. Marek tried once more. "You two seem to be getting along." She looked at him directly. That was the idea, was it not? He flushed. The others suddenly found their cups very interesting. I met his eyes without anger, only a steady calm that seemed to unsettle him more than any rebuke. He looked away first. After the meal, she rose without ceremony. "I need air," she said to no one in particular. She stepped through the side door that led to the narrow alley behind the tavern. The door swung shut behind her with a soft thud. I waited perhaps a minute. Long enough to be polite, short enough that the others would not have time to restart their performance. Then I followed. The night air was cool and damp. A light rain had begun, the kind that barely made a sound on the cobblestones but left a silver sheen on everything it touched. She stood under the narrow overhang of the roof, arms crossed loosely, watching the water gather in the gutter. Her braid had loosened slightly at the temple. A single strand of dark hair clung to her cheek. "Are you all right?" I asked. She did not turn at once. When she did, her expression was tired rather than wounded. "I am fine. I am simply tired of having to be fine in rooms that expect me to break." The words settled between us. I had no ready answer. The rain pattered on the wooden sign above the door. Somewhere inside, laughter rose again, muffled now by the wall. "They wanted a story," she said after a moment. "One where the orc woman is either grateful or angry. Either would have let them feel clever. You took that from them. I did not do it for them." "I know." She looked at me properly then. Rainlight caught in her eyes, turning them darker. "That is why I stayed." We stood without speaking for a while. The alley smelled of wet stone and the faint sweetness of the honey cake still on my fingers. Inside, someone called Marek's name. He would be wondering where we had gone. Let him wonder. When she finally moved, it was only to pull her shawl higher against the chill. I should go before the rain grows worse. I nodded. There was nothing else to offer that would not sound like pity. She stepped out from under the overhang. The rain touched her shoulders, darkening the green fabric in small spots. "Seraphina," I said. She paused. "My name is Darian." She studied me for a long moment, as if weighing whether the name changed anything. Then she gave the smallest nod, almost to herself. "Good night, Darian." She walked away down the alley without looking back. I watched until the shadows at the far end swallowed the line of her shoulders. The rain continued its quiet work on the stones. When I went back inside, the table had already begun to break apart. Marek avoided my eyes. Bran was already at the bar, ordering something stronger. I did not stay to hear what they would say once I left. I paid for my share of the meal and stepped out into the same rain that had taken her. For the first time in a very long while, the silence I returned to did not feel like something I had chosen. It felt like something that had been interrupted. I paid what I owed and left without speaking to anyone else at the table. The rain had settled into a steady, gentle rhythm that soaked through the shoulders of my coat before I had walked 20 paces. I did not mind it. The cold felt cleaner than the air inside the tavern. I had almost reached the main street when the door opened again behind me. Marek's voice called my name low and uncertain. I stopped, but did not turn. He came up beside me, pulling his own coat tighter. "I did not mean for it to feel like that," he said. I looked at him then. Water ran down the side of his face. He looked younger than usual, or perhaps simply less sure of himself. "You invited us as guests," I answered, "but you watched us as though we were a performance." He opened his mouth, closed it again. For once he had no quick reply. The rain filled the silence between us. Before he could find words, the side door of the tavern opened once more. Seraphina stepped out. She had her shawl pulled up over her head, but the rain had already begun to darken the fabric along her arms. She took in the two of us standing there and walked forward without hesitation. "I do not need anyone punished," she said, her voice calm and clear. She looked at Marek directly. "I only need fewer people who mistake cruelty for honesty." Marek's face went red. He lowered his head. "I am sorry. Truly. It was meant as a joke that got away from us." She studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "I accept your apology. That does not mean I will pretend it never happened." There was no anger in her tone, only a quiet boundary. I felt something shift inside my chest at the way she refused to shrink her own dignity to make him comfortable. Marek looked as though he wanted to say more, but she had already turned slightly toward me. When he finally went back inside, the door closed with a dull thud that left the alley quieter than before. The rain tapped steadily on the wooden overhang above us. "You knew what they were doing the moment you arrived," I said. She did not deny it. I have sat through enough of these evenings to recognize the shape of them. They wanted to see whether I would shrink or whether I would make a scene. Either result would have entertained them. Then why stay? Her eyes met mine. In the dim light from the tavern window, they looked almost black. "Because when you walked through that door, I wanted to see what kind of man you were. Most men in that situation would have chosen the easiest path, either laugh along or leave. You did neither. I thought about the broken engagement 3 years ago, the careful walls I had built since then. I have had enough of performances, I said, especially the kind that requires someone else to bleed for the sake of the joke. She was quiet for a while. The rain gathered in the gutter and ran toward the street in a thin silver line. Somewhere farther down the alley, a cat moved between crates, its eyes catching the light once before vanishing again. "Would you like to meet again?" I asked. The words came out before I could weigh them. Properly. Without an audience, without anyone waiting to see how we fail or succeed. She considered me. I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the habit of weighing risk before she answered. Then the corner of her mouth lifted, the same small movement I had seen when I first sat down. "Yes," she said, "but not tonight." I waited. "Tonight still carries the smell of their watching," she continued. "I want to know what we are like when no one else is measuring the distance between us." I nodded. The request made sense. It also felt like a test I was willing to take. She chose the old library on the western side of the city, the one that had stood since before the last border war. "If a man who works among books takes me somewhere dull," she said, "I will be disappointed. I will do my best to protect the honor of my profession," I answered. The smile that followed was real. It changed the shape of her face entirely, softening the guarded lines around her eyes. I found myself wanting to see it again, without rain, and without the weight of other people's expectations pressing in from every side. A carriage waited at the mouth of the alley, its driver already half asleep under his hood. She stepped toward it, then paused and looked back at me. "Thank you," she said, "for saying exactly what needed to be said." I shook my head. "You do not have to thank me for refusing to be cruel." "Perhaps not," she answered, "but I can thank you for being kind at the right moment." She climbed into the carriage. The door closed with a soft click. I watched the wheels turn and the vehicle pull away into the rain, its lamps growing smaller until they were only 2 points of warm light moving through the dark. Then even those disappeared around the corner. I stood under the overhang a little longer. The rain had soaked through my coat completely now. Water dripped from the brim of my hat onto the stones at my feet. Inside the tavern, someone laughed again, the sound muffled and distant. It no longer mattered what they said about the evening. The performance they had arranged had slipped out of their hands the moment I chose to sit down instead of walk away. Mark had brought her into my life by accident. For the first time in years, I was not entirely sorry he had. 3 days later, she appeared at the archive just after the morning rush had thinned. The heavy oak doors had been propped open to let in cooler air, and sunlight slanted across the long reading tables and pale gold bars. She wore a simple cloak, the color of old rust, fastened at the throat with a plain wooden pin. Her hair was loose today, falling in a dark wave past her shoulders. In one hand, she carried a small bound book of blank pages and a stick of charcoal wrapped in cloth. She looked exactly like herself, no attempt to soften her presence for the benefit of anyone watching. I met her near the central desk where the registry lay open. She glanced at the tall shelves that climbed toward the vaulted ceiling and gave a small nod, as though approving the space on first inspection. "I thought you might prefer to see where the quiet actually lives," I said. She followed without comment as I led her through the main hall. We passed cases holding maps of the borderlands drawn before the last war, their ink faded to the color of dried blood. Further on, shelves held herbals bound in cracked leather, their pages still smelling faintly of pressed leaves and old resin. At the far end, I stopped before a lower case that held volumes of poetry copied by orc scribes from the eastern clans. The script was angular and strong, the paper thicker than human vellum. She ran one finger along the spine of the nearest book but did not open it yet. "You keep these here openly." "They survived the fires that took the eastern libraries," I answered. "Someone thought they were worth saving. I only make sure they stay saved." She chose one of the poetry volumes and carried it to a window seat where the light fell across the pages. I went to the back workroom and returned with a slim book I had copied years ago from a traveling illuminator's notes. It described how to grind pigments from river stones and certain mountain clays, how to bind them with egg yolk or pine resin so the color would hold on paper or wood. She looked at the title when I placed it beside her. One eyebrow rose. "Are you courting me with professional texts?" "I only have so many tools," I said. She turned a page, studying the careful diagrams of grinding stones and the lists of colors that could be coaxed from ordinary earth. Then I am fortunate, she said after a moment, that I happen to like these particular tools. We sat for a long time without speaking. Outside the window, the street moved with its usual rhythm of carts and voices. Inside, the only sounds were the occasional turning of pages and the soft scratch of her charcoal when she paused to sketch something from the pigment book onto her own blank pages. Once she held up the drawing for me to see. She had captured the shape of a grinding bowl and the way light fell across the powdered color inside it. The lines were economical and sure. Later, she asked the question I had been expecting since the night at the tavern. "Do you believe you must protect me?" I considered the words before answering. "No. I believe Bran tried to turn you into something he could laugh at without consequence." I did not agree to be part of that. She was quiet for so long that I thought she might not reply. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "Most people decide who I am before I have finished my first sentence. They hear the shape of my voice or see the color of my skin and the story is already written. You waited." "I would like to keep waiting," I said. "I would like to hear what you actually say." She looked at me then with an expression I could not fully read. It held both caution and something warmer, something that made the space between us feel smaller than the wide table allowed. After that first visit, she returned. Sometimes she came to the archive in the quiet hours between the morning scholars and the afternoon visitors. Other times I walked across the city to the eastern quarter where her classroom occupied the upper floor of a narrow stone building that had once been a warehouse. The children sat on low benches with slates balanced on their knees. When I arrived, she was usually kneeling beside one of them, guiding a small hand through the shape of a letter or the curve of a leaf. She never introduced me as anything more than a visitor who knew about old books. The children accepted this without question and soon began showing me their drawings as well. One afternoon, a girl no older than 8 presented me with a picture of a dragon whose wings were colored the exact shade of Seraphina's cloak. "She said you keep the old stories safe," the child announced, "so I made you one that can fly over the library and watch the pages." Seraphina watched from across the room, charcoal still in her fingers, and smiled in a way that made the tired lines around her eyes disappear. A week after the night at the tavern, Marek came to the archive. He waited until the last visitor had left before approaching the desk where I was repairing a torn map. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back like a man reporting to a superior. "I was cruel," he said. "I told myself it was only a joke because that made it easier to sleep. It was not a joke. It was small and ugly, and I am sorry." I set the map aside. "Tell her, not me." He did. 2 days later, he went to her classroom after the children had gone home. She listened, accepted the apology in the same clear, unadorned way she had accepted it in the rain, and made it plain that acceptance did not erase what had been done. When Marek told me afterward, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. I respected her more for refusing to offer false comfort. I also found myself thinking of her more often in the hours between our meetings. 3 months after that first evening, I was helping her sort a new box of colored chalks the children had received from an anonymous donor, when one of the boys looked up from his slate and asked without preamble, "Are you her sweetheart, sir?" The room went very still. Several small heads turned. Seraphina's hands paused above the box of chalk. She did not speak. She simply looked at me, waiting. I met the boy's eyes. "I am trying," I said, "to become worthy of that title." A ripple of delighted noise moved through the children. Someone clapped. Another whistled through missing teeth. Seraphina's smile started slowly and then spread until it reached her eyes and stayed there. In that moment, the narrow classroom, with its cracked plaster and low benches, felt larger than any hall I had ever stood in. She did not need rescuing. She needed someone who would stand beside her while she did the work she loved, and who would not look away when the world tried to make her smaller. I realized I wanted to be that person, not for one evening, not to prove a point to Marek or Bran, simply because the alternative had begun to feel like a life I no longer wished to lead. 2 years passed in the way that matters most, not with grand gestures or sudden declarations shouted across crowded rooms, but with the slow accumulation of ordinary days that asked nothing dramatic of us. Seraphina did not need a man who appeared only when someone tried to diminish her. She needed someone who remained when the insults had faded and the work of living simply continued. I learned to love her in the spaces between the notable moments. On the coldest mornings, I carried a bucket of coal to the eastern quarter before the children arrived so the classroom would not bite their fingers when they tried to hold chalk. I searched merchant stalls for the particular blue pigment that came from a certain riverbed stone and brought it to her wrapped in oiled cloth. When one of her students lost a parent, I sat with her on the low bench after the others had gone and let her speak or sit in silence, whichever the day required. I did not tell her to smile. I had learned that some griefs deserve the full weight of their own time. She chose me in return, though she never framed it as rescue. She began appearing at the archive in the late afternoons with her sleeves rolled and her hair tied back, helping me rearrange the heavy folios of illustrations that had grown disordered over decades. One afternoon she produced a new name board for the children's reading corner, the letters carved and painted with the same careful hand she used on everything she touched. She knew without being told that I preferred my tea bitter and without honey. I knew she could not abide the sharp taste of wild celery that appeared in certain stews. These were not the sort of facts that changed the course of kingdoms. They were the sort that made a life feel inhabited rather than merely endured. When the second winter after our meeting began to loosen its grip, I asked her to return with me to the old library on the western side of the city. The same window seat where she had first opened the book of Orc poetry still caught the afternoon light in the same way. The air still smelled of beeswax and paper and the faint metallic tang of the ink that never quite left the room no matter how often the floors were swept. No one else was present. Marek had not been invited. Bran would never have been welcome. It was only the two of us and the quiet that had first let us speak without performance. I had carried the small silver ring in my pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for the right ordinary day rather than manufacturing a dramatic one. The band was narrow and plain except for the engraving on the inside, a quill crossed with a paintbrush, small enough that only someone holding it close would see. I went down on one knee between the shelves of border maps. The stone floor was cold through the fabric of my trousers, but the cold felt honest. "I do not want to be only the man who defended you on one evening," I said. "I want to be the man who chooses you on every ordinary morning after. Seraphina Mossvale, will you marry me?" Her eyes filled before she answered. She pressed the heel of one hand against her cheek as if the tears themselves were an inconvenience she had not planned for. Then she laughed, a low sound that carried relief and something brighter. "Yes," she said. "But if you forget to buy pigments for the classroom, I will still scold you." "I am marrying a teacher," I answered. "I have already prepared myself to be corrected for the rest of my life." She pulled me to my feet and held me there between the tall cases of books until the light through the windows shifted and the room grew dimmer. Neither of us spoke for a long while. There was nothing that needed saying that had not already been said in the accumulation of small days. The wedding took place in the courtyard behind the archive on a clear afternoon in early summer. The students had covered every available surface with drawings hung from strings between the old stone pillars. Dragons with wings too large for their bodies. Frogs tucked into the corners of every scene. A portrait of a mother drawn entirely from memory and love. Marek stood at the back in a plain coat, quiet and present, offering no speeches. Bran had not been told the date. When Seraphina walked between the rows of benches, the gathered friends and colleagues did not cry out of pity or surprise. They cried because they were witnessing something they had been taught could not exist. A woman who had once been turned into someone else's entertainment now being loved openly, steadily, and without condition. The tears were not for what had been endured. They were for what had been chosen instead. I had once believed that silence and order were the safest way to move through the world. That night at the Brass Lantern had been meant as entertainment for others and discomfort for us. My friends had arranged a blind meeting with an orc woman because they wanted to see how I would react when forced to sit beside someone they considered lesser. They expected either awkward refusal or polite endurance. What they received was something they could not easily laugh away. I simply refused to let a kind and capable woman be reduced to a spectacle. Seraphina never needed me to save her from the world. She needed only someone who would look at her before listening to the world's judgments about what she was allowed to be. From one evening arranged for the wrong reasons, I found the person I wanted to keep choosing. Not once, in front of witnesses who might later change their minds, every day, in the quiet rooms where the real work of living happened until the last page of whatever story we were writing together finally closed.